Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April 9th edition of the Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting. My name is Richard Brown. I'm the head of community development at MakerDAO. In keeping with the trend that we've been seeing over the last few weeks, we have a furious level of activity going on in the governance community, and that's translated into a pile of things that we need to go over in this call. So the agenda is diverse and it's large, so I'm going to keep my section to a minimum. This is what we have for the agenda this week, though. Charles St. Louis is going to give us a review of MIP number 3, my favorite MIP of all. It's a MIP that goes over what the governance cycle will look like in the future, so we help the ecosystem begin to internalize some of the processes that they've brought to the table for us. LongForWisdom will give us his governance at a glance segment. Will Barnes is back and better than ever. He's going to review the GSM and the dark fix. Those were very, very important discussions back in the olden days before everything changed, but they're still important now, and it's time to revisit some of these legacy threads, which is another topic that I've been sort of beating the drum on for the last couple of weeks as well. We can't lose old threads, so he's going to give us talk about the dark fix and also a review of what what solutions need to be moved to the social layer and what that social layer looks like. So, interesting discussion. Mariano is here to talk about SCD shutdown and give us a bit of a how-to, because this is actually, that ties into what I want to talk about today too, but it's not, SCD shutdown is not a matter of pressing a button, it's complicated. MakerMan is here. He's going to give us a very brief recap of some of the work that he's picked up. Super exciting work, depending on your definition of exciting, but I'm very happy to see him jump in and pick up a task that was complicated and needed to be done. So he's going to talk about zero bid, vault auction, and how to model that data. Cyrus is going to give us a heads up on a new series of risk calls we have next week, and then Bishesh will talk to us about the state of the peg. Huge agenda, not a lot of time to go over it, so I'm going to do my segment very quickly, and then we can move on. And so I only have one thought, and this is the thought of the day. It's going to tie into some...
Rich, can I interrupt you for a second? Can I just put out my quick PSA right now, because it's just 30 seconds.
Well, you wrecked my flow already, so yeah. Go
ahead. Yeah, just wanted to put out a small notice. A few weeks ago, we were doing risk presentations on some tooling that we wanted to walk through with governance. Obviously, that got sidetracked a bit. So we wanted to resume that work next week, and we just kind of wanted to do it on consecutive days. So we're going to be holding additional governance calls next week on Tuesday and Wednesday. The timing will probably be 1 hour after what the current timing of the governance call is. But now I'll put out some other public notice as well. We just wanted to give a heads up that we will have additional Tuesday and Wednesday risk calls next week.
Just for that. All right, thanks. So, yeah, for now, thanks for that, Cyrus. And so this is probably going to be something we see more in the future, where we're reaching density on what can be achieved in these calls. The variety of topics that need to be addressed. We had these chats a long time ago, whether we should have 4 or 5 different types of calls during the course of the week. It was my opinion that it's better to wait until we see what work looks like and we reach density before we start splitting off into separate corners to do other stuff. And I think that we're rapidly approaching that state right now. So Cyrus's team has been doing a fantastic amount of work, piles and piles and piles to go over, and there's just no chance we can take care of it in these calls. And so next week is risk week, sort of like Shark Week, but with numbers. Okay, back to the super important stuff that I was about to say. We have lots and lots of things that are happening at once. The community is self-organizing in ways that I could only have dreamed were possible 6-12 months ago. I'm super happy about that. the community as a whole is taking care of its own destiny, and that's what the DAO is all about, and that's what people have been working towards. And as that autonomy increases, we're going to run into some more growing pains. That's basically what governance is. It's just a never-ending series of growing pains and improvements and iterations. We've been growing and iterating and improving all the time, so that obviously I don't think that's a problem. But here's some examples of things that have been happening in the community just very recently. So we have the community brought to us a vote about SCD shutdown. They brought up a vote for vault compensation. They brought up a vote for ranked choice, adding a new type of voting or polling to our system that presumably and hopefully will be better able to capture signaling in the ecosystem. All of these things are very healthy and very cool. Here's the but, and you know, there's always going to be a but when I start talking about stuff. The but is that there's constraints that we all operate under. The question becomes what is possible in timelines allocated to us in light of all the other things that are on the critical path, and etc. So what I want to talk about is how we handle coordination when polls go through or when polls are getting proposed. There's a fantastic, that's the fourth time I say fantastic. There's a large number of moving pieces involved with the ecosystem. Piles of stakeholders, piles of process, piles of actors both inside the foundation, inside the DAO, or inside the crypto space or the DeFi space in general. So I want us to start thinking about coordination of tasks, determining feasibility, making sure that stakeholders have been brought into the conversations, because we're going to run into situations where everybody, or I shouldn't say everybody. So when the community, the majority of the community signals their intent to move in a certain direction or have something happen, that's great. That's what governance is all about. But intent doesn't equal implementation necessarily. So I'm speaking roundabout issues. So let me give you some examples. So the SCD shutdown is a good one. So the community came up with the desire to shut down SCD. They came up with did some research and figured that April 24th is a good day to do it. I do not dispute that, but we're going to see very soon that there's things that might not be literally possible to do. We're going to have timing constraints, resource constraints, just purely mechanical constraints. There's occasionally we're going to run into things that smart contracts just simply cannot do, or that we're going to require alterations to smart contracts which imply additional auditing or testing, and developers need to be found and reallocated. So there's implementation details that are going to impact these timelines. And so I would ask the community that when we start coming up with these polls in the forums, that we do a better job at identifying, we're doing a feasibility study, identifying the stakeholders that are required to make the thing happen, and to ensure that the thing that people want to have happen is possible in the times that have been the wish list for timing has been determined that it's possible to implement. Sorry, I drifted for a second there towards the end, but the good news is that I'm over, or I'm done. So let me hand this off to Charles, I think, who's going to give us a walkthrough of MIP number 3, which is all related to the governance cycle, which possibly will be a solution to some of these issues that I just brought up for us. Charles.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, so hey everyone. Before I kind of get started into actually walking through MIP 3, I would like to give a brief overview of what's going on in the world of MIPS in relation to governance. So recently we launched a couple blog posts detailing the self-sustaining MakerDAO initiative. And one of those key pillars in becoming a self-sustainable DAO is the proposals that are created through the Maker Improvement Proposal Framework. So on Monday, we actually proposed the initial 13 MIPS that we feel necessary to create long-term governance and self-sustainability of the protocol. So as of this week, there's been a lot of constructive feedback and positive feedback from a lot of the community members, and I do encourage anyone here who hasn't taken a look yet to dig into them, or at least read them if you have the time. In terms of the actual MIPS, and the phase of this whole thing that I'll get into later, the current MIPS are technically under review during this period of time. And what that means is that the MIP authors work with the community members on integrating this feedback within the MIPS to try to cover all the bases, any gaps that are there, or any wording that needs some clarifying. And this period will last until April 27th. And on April 27th exactly, there will be something called a timing poll, which is a special governance poll, which basically gives the community the chance to decide if you want to proceed with a ratification vote for these 13 MIPS so that they'll actually be formally in place, or to delay that vote for 1 month and institute a period of time for competing proposals to be proposed by the community. So if the community does indeed decide to proceed with this ratification vote, it will occur over the period of May 1st to 4th. And if the vote does pass, the first governance cycle, defining MIP 3 that I'm about to walk through, would begin on May 4th itself. So that's some background context on all of that. And there will be some references to MIP 0 during this kind of walkthrough. So I do urge anyone to try and read through that. I know it's quite long, but it does help clarify everything that's going on in the world of MIPS. So now I'm going to share my screen. All right, can everyone see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Cool. Okay, so MIP 3 is a proposal to create this new governance cycle. So this new formal governance cycle has the goal of being this predictable framework for maker holders and the community to make decisions and make these decisions transparent. And it's very focused on a certain time period. So it's a monthly governance cycle, and it standardizes, basically, it's standardized through a course of meetings and results driven throughout the process. So the MIP itself has two main components: the governance cycle breakdown, which is a week-by-week breakdown over the course of the 4 weeks of the month. And in addition to that, there's the definition and process for changing something called the default inclusion threshold, which will initially be set at 3,000 MKR, that is. I'll get into more on what the purpose of that is, but these are the main reasons for this proposal. Actually, I'm going to share this in the chat. Or can someone share this in the chat?
Yeah, I'll post it for you.
Thanks. So in terms of the first component of this MIP, there's the governance cycle breakdown. So each monthly governance cycle begins on the first Monday of the month, with maker and proposals being submitted by community members or by the foundation at this period of time. These proposals will be considered for inclusion at the end of the month during the executive vote. And the governance cycle ends with the executive vote that would begin on the fourth Monday of said month. After the executive vote occurs, there will be a period of time for review. So a meeting somewhat like this, where you kind of talk about the retroactive aspects of the month and also plan for the next month ahead. Also to note, the time in this weekly governance cycle is based on UTC. We felt that we had to make that clear. The first week of the governance cycle is when the actual MIP proposals themselves are formally submitted into the governance cycle. So in order to provide some context, formal submission is the fifth step in a MIPS lifecycle. Before that, there is the conception phase, which is basically when the idea of a MIP is brought up in a discourse forum or on Twitter or anything. It's just when this idea is born, basically. Next is when the actual proposal is submitted to the discourse forum, where it needs to comply with the actual components and criterion in the MIP template itself. So the MIP editor would go in and see that, yes, this fits all the standards and the criteria is met, it's good to go. After that, it enters a formal request for comments period, where in this case is exactly what's happening now, where the community and the MIP authors work together to iterate on the actual content and format of the MIP to achieve the broadest consensus from everyone in the ecosystem. After that, so during the RFC phase, there's a couple things that are important to note. So there's something called the feedback period and the frozen period. So the feedback period is the minimum amount of time that the community has to review this specific MIP or MIPs. And the frozen period is when everything is set in stone and there's no more changes that can be made, and it's awaiting to be formally submitted. At that period of time, when those criteria have been met, it officially enters the formal submission phase, which is what is happening on the first Monday to Wednesday of this month here. So the formal submission is done basically by submitting to the discourse forum as well as GitHub, and then it can be iterated on. During the first Thursday of that month is when the actual inclusion poll review meeting happens. So this is when the community comes together and discusses which proposals are in accordance with the guidelines, as well as which ones may seem kind of, I guess, appealing to the community. Week 2 is when the actual governance facilitator pushes this inclusion poll. The proposals that the governance facilitators have gauged general consensus on are included. And this week 2 is very heavily reliant on the governance facilitator kind of working with the community and trying to figure out which are the best ones to get included. So as I mentioned before, there's something called the default inclusion threshold. It's a variable amount that can be changed with the sub-proposals that are defined later on. This threshold is a value that is automatically counted towards the no vote tally of the inclusion poll itself. So the default inclusion threshold is changed with these proposals if the community feels like the current value is not there. Now, I do know that the value is not set in this MIP itself, but I do have to make that change and be upfront that I did not include it. It will be 3000 MQR. So during this inclusion poll, basically the community comes together and they vote yes or no on whether to include this proposal to pass. The outcomes are, if the yes votes for the given option in the inclusion poll are higher than the combination of no votes plus this default inclusion threshold of 3000 MQR, the poll passes. We're now on the second Thursday of the month when the governance poll review occurs. This is much like the current governance polls, where general risk and governance topics are discussed at hand without any MIP decision making occurring. Next is week 3. So in the third Monday and Wednesday of the month, the governance poll will officially be submitted by this governance facilitator, and the poll will run for the duration of Monday until Wednesday. The poll is also a yes and no MQR poll that accepts or rejects the combination of all the MIPs and that have passed in this inclusion stage, as mentioned before. And then we're on to the Thursday of the month. So this is the big meeting where the governance community comes together and basically decides on reviewing the executive vote options. So it is a public meeting that will focus either on future proposals or any controversies surrounding the current governance poll and future upcoming executive vote with relation to those MIPs. So in the case that there are too many no votes in the governance poll and there's evidence that there is an effort to silence any legitimate concerns that the community has, the governance facilitator must consider whether it is a risk actually proposing this executive vote and could cause potentially a governance split. So in that case, the governance facilitator can decide to not deploy the executive vote itself, but they must openly communicate to the community why this decision has been made. So in the future, when there are multiple governance facilitators, ideally they'd all be in consensus that the executive vote creates this significant risk, and they all kind of agree to not post it. Yes, that kind of is a more longer term thing, but it is needed to be mentioned. So the last week of the governance cycle is week 4, and during the Monday of the month, the executive vote is actually submitted if indeed the governance poll had passed in the past and the no votes are not too high to deem it a threat to consensus. So this regular vote, executive vote that will be proposed will last for 7 days, meaning that it will be in effect after those 7 days. So the last period of time, so let's say that executive vote passes, and now we're in this last period of time in the governance cycle. So this is the retro and planning meeting, where I did mention this before. It's kind of a retroactive and assessment of what happened during that month, and also maybe some time can be allotted to actually planning for the next month to be proactive. You can think about the poll outcomes and what can be optimized, or maybe some changes that could be made. Sub-proposals on modifying the actual default inclusion threshold can be discussed, and so on. So this is an overview of exactly what the governance cycle looks like. I put it next to the steps that overlap with the MIP cycle to kind of tie them both together. So just to give a brief overview, the governance cycle begins with these proposal submissions. Then it is discussed upon to include them into this inclusion pool. The inclusion poll happens, the governance poll review meeting then happens, the governance poll occurs, and then the big meeting review for the executive occurs, and lastly, the executive vote either accepts or rejects these MIPs. The second component of the governance cycle, MIP 3, is the default inclusion modification proposal. So as I mentioned, this threshold is crucial to the poll and is set at 3,000 MQR currently, but can be discussed. I mean, it's probably the biggest thing that we want feedback on at this point. In this component, there's a default period of 3 months. So when someone submits the change for the default inclusion threshold, it will last for a period of 3 months, and the frozen period 1 month. Do know that these periods can overlap, and it is based on the MIPS author's decision on whether the frozen period can start before or after the default feedback period. And basically, we just provide this template for making those proposals to change the default inclusion threshold, which includes the number of the sub-proposal, the author, the date proposed. And then the specification section is the summary. So it's a proposal to modify this threshold to this value. What's the reason behind it? And what is the exact value? So that was a lot of me talking, and I'm sure there's some questions, but that is an overview of what MIP 3 does look like. And I do encourage everyone to ask questions. I'm not sure if we have much time on this call, but please go into this forum or in the Rocket Chat channel and fire off all the questions you have, or feedback, or any additions that you may think are necessary.
All right, cool. Thanks, Charles. I'm not seeing questions in the chat, but yeah, I want to echo that. This is going to be one of the first MIPs that we put into practice on a regular basis. And so people have questions, comments, forum is the place to do it. We'll be reviewing.
Can I ask one question before we roll on this? It's sort of a general question. Why pick fixed amount of maker for these thresholds, like for the ES, for this 3,000, for this? Why isn't it a % of outstanding?
Oh, sorry, can you repeat that?
My question is why do we pick fixed amounts of Maker for thresholds on things rather than a % of the outstanding?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that, but it's a good suggestion that you could provide on the MIP itself. I mean, it's kind of a bigger question in general. Do you have a preference? Could be a bit of a confirmation
well, it doesn't
bias
make
question.
sense. If you burn Maker, and let's say you burn through half the Maker,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the thresholds change on everything. And so the question, it begs the question, what's the point of having thresholds on things to accomplish actions? And then the next question is, if you're going to have a threshold, why isn't it related to the outstanding at the time versus a fixed number that will be a % that changes relative to the outstanding?
Yeah, it's a good point. Well, actually, I don't need to explain it to you, MakerMan, but I'll say it out loud anyways. The thresholding is one of the trickiest things you can do when you're coming up with a system, particularly one that has algorithmic aspects and human aspects as well. I'm sure that the MIP architects would be completely open to a more refined approach, though, if you have suggestions about how to do the thresholding.
Well, I think I just mentioned it. Everybody can think about it. It's just when I first looked at it, I was like, you know, the outstanding is going to change by definition. So why would you have a fixed number? It just didn't make sense. So think about it. We can move this.
That's a good point.
I'm done with it.
Yeah, I've had the same questions about Shutdown as well, why 50K. So it's an interesting question to explore. All right, but we do have a lot to get over today. LongForWisdom, can you give us a super brief governance at a glance?
I'm not sure how brief it will be, but I'll try.
Try hard.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Cool. So, to be fair, most of the discussions and things going on in the forum are around MIPS, at least the discussions. So, there's been a lot of discussion on the release of the 13 initial Maker improvement proposals, just like in the thread that Charles posted that deals with them in general. There's been a lot of response and back and forth on that. So I'd encourage everyone to read that anyway, because it just has an index of all the MIPS and sort of what they are and things. Summaries somewhere else. Then some of the other MIPS that are attracting probably the most discussion at this point are MIP 0 and MIP 3. So I would suggest if you have limited time and you're only going to look at a couple of MIPS or one MIP, I would start with MIP 0, and then MIP 3 should probably be the second one. They're probably the ones that have the most effect on what's going to be happening soon. So let's see other active discussions. So also, as Rich mentioned earlier, the Vault compensation discussions are continuing. Joshua's been working on getting polls up and sort of worded properly. Seems like that's going fairly well. The current plan seems to be having multiple polls to determine different aspects of station. I believe the first poll is up still. Yeah, which is just a sort of general, should we compensate at all, yes or no? Yes is currently winning. I believe next week, or we'll be asking whether if any compensation, like regardless of how much it is, whether it should be denominated in DAI or the Vault asset, so ETH or MAT. And then the week after we'll be doing another one. So seeking consensus then. So as I just mentioned, the Vault holder polls. Also the ranked choice voting as an option for governance polls was on chain for the last couple of days and seems to have passed, which is cool. So hopefully soon we will have the option to use ranked choice voting for governance polls, which will be amazing. So many thanks to Sam for sorting that, or for sort of spearheading that. Yeah, so the other major kind of discussion at the moment is around SED shutdown. Again, Richard mentioned this as well. So we passed the initial poll on chain to initiate the shutdown on April the 24th. Whether we can meet that target, I'm not sure, but I guess we'll see. Yeah, so I think the only other thing I wanted to mention was that there's a number of governance initiatives going on. So if you have extra time and want to read about stuff that people are doing, then I would suggest clicking the ongoing initiatives link in Governance at a Glance. And I recently added a help wanted post requesting a plugin that allows for signaling with MKR on a discourse forum. So at the very least, we can explore that option in the future. I think that about covers it, Rich.
Okay, thanks. If you do have time and you are interested in governance and you do like forums or some combination of all three of those things, please join us and use LongForWisdom's Governance at a Glance as a launching point, because it's the upcoming initiatives that probably demand the most attention. I keep on repeating this, but I'll say it again, that governance is happening at an ever increasing pace in our ecosystem. The community is self-organizing. Decisions are getting made that require input. So please join the forum and be heard, because once it goes on chain, that's too late to change anything. All right. Well, I'm going to hand it over to you now to give us the Darkfix GSM and social layer.
Yeah.
Presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I'll be pretty fairly quick since there's people behind me. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, back in February, we actually started this discussion about what to do if we have a critical bug. And then it was pretty much usurped by the events of March. So the purpose of this discussion is to really revisit two topics that we need to start thinking about. First is the GSM, which is during the downturn, we actually changed it to 4 hours. I'd like to think about what we should do in the future with the GSM, with this, with the experiences we had with March. And then to discuss the dark spell social layer, which is still very much up in the air. We proposed 3 methods back in February, but I'd like to discuss them again and then I'd like to formalize that discussion into a document so if we ever need to use it, at least in the interim, short term, before it's formalized into a MIP, we know what to do. We'll first just discuss the GSM delay. I'll discuss these slides, and then I'll walk through the dark spell slides, but then we can have a short discussion. Just make sure we get through the.
All right, there you go.
Cool. All right. So the GSM delay is currently 4 hours. We ended up in this state in mid-March. I think it was the 13th or 14th. I can't remember the exact day, but it prompts the discussion of what do we feel the optimal GSM delay is and how do we get there? Do we want to return directly to 24 hours? Was 24 hours the right time? And so, yeah, I want to have that discussion and get feedback from the community on how to handle that. And also precedent, we moved to 4 hours. I want to understand, was 4 hours the right time? What did people think of that move? What to do about future situations? And also DEFCON spells. Chris Mooney has developed spells that are purpose-built for situations or adverse conditions. If, Chris, you want to have a talk about how that could actually fit into that later. For that. Moving quickly, the dark spell social layer. This is something we need to find consensus on soon. First is I won't actually discuss what the dark spell is beyond it just provides us a way to patch a bug without exposing the bytecode on chain. For many different reasons, that's important because, first of all, someone can reverse engineer the code that's sitting on chain before the bug fix is applied. The code implementation is ready, but we need to actually understand the social layer, how we're going to handle that. And then emergency shutdown is still an option. Critical bug and I'll be very general about this, at least, very big bug, at least 10% of the value of collateral tokens in the system are affected, must be not theoretical, and must be operational, which is where we're at right now with MCD, I guess about 5 months into the deployment. Non-critical
Can I ask a question? This is interesting though. Where did this criteria come from?
This
Is
is
this just internal, or is this industry best practice?
This is HackerOne. This is our HackerOne bug bounty. What defines a critical bug?
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So, and then non-critical bugs will still surface through existing governance channels, like Kurt discussed recently. Debt auctions can be blocked. Things like that will not be patched with the dark spell. It's just unnecessary. I think those are better served just discussing them in public and then passing them through a normal vote. So yeah, it's important the dark spell is only used in exceptional circumstances. It should really be if like a critical bug that affects a lot of ether, a lot of DAI, and it's also designed to obscure as much information as possible. So given this, it's the whole purpose of the social layer is that we have a clear but narrow mandate to cast this thing. So it should be really only focused on fixing a critical bug that would otherwise be damaging across the board. So back in February, we proposed these 3 models: the major MKR holders model, independent auditor attestation model, and a community appointed trusted party model. I really just want to go through these 3 slides, just discuss them again, because I think these are where we're going to frame the discussion, and we'd like to get community signal which one they feel is best fitting for multi-collateral DAI, and then also we can tweak these and discuss implementation details in the forums. But the major MKR holders model is just a pre-selected community of MKR holders. The dev team, current or EPC, will interact directly with this committee when a bug is discovered, coordinate the fix. The MKR holders will sign the transaction confirming support for the solution, and then the dark spell will be used to patch the bug. Some of the advantages is that the number of people with knowledge of the bug is kept to a minimum, but then there's some disadvantages to that. It's high trust that the dev team and MKR holder committee does the right thing. Maybe the MKR holder doesn't feel comfortable attesting to the fix, or just doesn't have the technical acumen. Bugs can be quite complicated in the system, and there's just various myriad potential conflicts of interest. So the implementation details I'd like to discuss in greater detail on the forums. We can really discuss the fine print and how this is actually handled, but how many members of the committee, when to select a new committee, how to communicate with large MKR holders when a bug is discovered. These are just various things we'll need to discuss given this model. The second model is the independent auditor attestation model. So essentially a independent auditor, an agreement with an independent auditor is in place. If a bug is discovered, we interact directly with that auditor. They attest to the validity of that vulnerability, sign off on it, ensure that the fixes what needs to be fixed, and then we use the dark spell in the situation. And similar to the previous model, a number of people with knowledge of this bug is kept quite minimum. And this also introduces an advantage where the community has input on how this IA is selected. It's not just MKR holders, large MKR holders influencing the decision. Disadvantages are along the same lines. It's quite centralized, but there's governance oversight. There's costs associated with having an agreement in place. Not really know the specifics, but the costs to provide a certain level of service, response time, things like that. Again, implementation details. Would like the community to weigh in on the relationship, the IA relationship. What do we want from the auditor? how to select it, various criteria. And there's also some more flexibility to design a process here. For example, we could have an existing set of existing independent auditor, but then when a bug is discovered, the community can choose a second to sort of validate alongside the existing list of our auditor as a means to prevent, like bribery or just act as like a check. And the third is community appointed trusted party model, which is a little different. This is a bit more reactionary in nature. When a bug is discovered, the community is informed as best as they can without revealing technical details of the bug. And the community drives the patching of the bug. They have to go select the appointed trusted party model to attest to it. And then once agreement is there, the community appointed trusted party feels that this is a vulnerability that needs to be patched and is critical, then the dark spell would be used. This could take longer than normal. If you could get mired in some debate on what to do and then the bug's just existing. So there's some things to consider with this model as well. Those are the three models. We're not necessarily confined to just one. If there's things we like about others, we can introduce like another model as a backstop. And the goal is to understand the community's preferred solution, which I'd like to do through signaling on the forums. And then once we have an idea of the model that is, I guess, I would say the most salient, we can iterate and further optimize that solution and shrine it in a document and create a policy around it so we have a process to follow should a bug be discovered. So this is the last slide here. I'd like to begin discussion on these methods. I would like to understand what the community thinks of these, what they do and don't like, and we can start assembling this document, putting together things that the community feels most important, and then on the medium to long term, actually formalize this in a MIP. I don't see this as happening in the short term. This is something we need to think about on the medium to long term. So those are the 2 points I'd like to discuss. And but I also want to be cognizant of the folks behind me. Can discuss any questions real quick. I would be happy to take them.
There are mostly just comments in the sidebar, but one of the things I wanted to just clarify though is you said important in the medium to long term. Do you mean the formalizing it into a MIP is important in the medium to long term, or do you mean addressing the entire issue of dark fixes?
I see like the MIP at this situation is more like the tertiary thing, is that we do need to put it in that. But first we need to find the method which we're going to handle bug fix, and to have the policy in place. The MIP is important, but until we get there, we need to make sure we all have consensus on how a bug will be handled.
Yeah, I agree that it's always extremely difficult to try and figure out how important something is, what the sense of urgency is on an unknown.
Yeah.
But particularly as the community begins to accelerate and we see things like let's do SED shutdown, let's do zero-bid auction compensation, let's do ranked choice, that means that new code is coming into the system. And traditionally the foundation releases code once a year at most. And then after it's been audited 3 or 4 different times, that process is potentially going to change as we accelerate in the future. So it feels to me like this is something that needs to be cleared up sooner rather than later.
I agree. Yeah, I think it's better we have, at least we have a document, even if it's not formal yet, that we can act on if something happens.
All right, well, I'm looking forward to seeing your post. So thanks for volunteering. That's going to be, it's a big lift. So it's great that you're stepping up to do that.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, man. And also, thanks for surviving the bombing without losing your cool. Well done. All right, Mariano, you're up.
Hey, thank you. Okay, I'll try to be brief. There's 3.5 million Psi in the migration contract still. And last week's executive that was supposed to shut down the bridge from Psi to DAI still hasn't passed. And we're going to have a new executive tomorrow. And we're 2 weeks away from the proposed date to shut down SED. And I just want to let the community know that if SED, single collateral DAI, is shut down and there is still Psi as collateral in the MCD system, this can potentially create unintended consequences, right? One single collateral DAI is shut down, then that token is no longer a stable coin. You know, it becomes a claim on an amount of Ether at the price that the system was shut down. But the migration contract, since it is a special contract, it does treat Psi as one-to-one to DAI, right? And if we still have a large amount of Psi in the system after shutdown, then we're very dependent on what happens with the price of Ether, and just Psi becomes a less than ideal collateral to have, because if hopefully the price of Ether goes up, then there's going to be keepers that are incentivized to grab all of that remaining Psi from the migration contract. But if the price of Ether starts going down, then we no longer respect, you know, the system in saying that DAI is properly backed by collateral, right? Because Psi is going to be worth less, and we would have to figure out ways of removing this collateral because nobody's going to be incentivized to do so. And in the end, if we keep it long enough, then governance may even need to pass a spell that says, okay, we're going to generate DAI out of the system so that the governance itself removes this Psi from the migration contract and sells it in the open market, whatever. And if we're incur in a loss, then we're going to have more debt auctions and so on, so on. That's not the only way to do it, but it's one way to do it. So I just want to put this forth to the community that it is very important, at least on an engineering economic level. It's pretty important that the contract is drained of funds before we do the shutdown.
All right, thanks for that, Mariano. And I think that pleasingly ties into what I was talking about at the top of the call, where community can signal intention, a poll can get presented, but there are orders of operations, there's mechanical, there's legal, there's regulatory, there's smart contract, there's resourcing, there's all kinds of issues that have to align in the right order to make sure that these things are successful. This sounds like one of them. So Mariano, did you have sorry, I might have drifted, maybe I missed the point, I hope not, but so what do you think the solution is? Is that sort of like a call to arms, like, hey, get out there and vote, or wait for the next time this thing comes around, because presumably on Monday, and vote for that one? Is that the idea? Yeah,
I don't know if it's my place as a foundation employee still to say anything. I think it's more of just like saying what I think is going on with the system and people making their own decisions. One thing we may have done wrong is packing that particular spell, mixed with some other risk parameters. Maybe people do want to shut down the migration contract, but they didn't want to reduce the stability fee in USDC from 16 to 12. I don't know. It could be that this warrants its own executive spell, maybe. Maybe we can move this to the forums as well. Maybe by some miracle we get 3088 to migrate, which is the last big CDP in single collateral DAI. I think I don't really have a solution how to do this. I just want to stress the fact that the migration contract should be drained before. And yeah, I can provide a couple of different solutions, but the one that has been provided so far is voting on stopping the site to die bridge. This only stops SCI drawing die with SCI. It doesn't stop CDPs from migrating, and it doesn't stop the bridge on the other way. So going back from dying to SCI.
All right, thanks, Mariano. And very diplomatically said, I was trying to lure you into making a proclamation, but you dodged
no.
it. You're also hitting a bunch of other hot topic or hot button issues for me. One of those is obviously the bundling issue, and as keeps on, like I'm a broken record at this point, but as the complexity of the ecosystem, as the number of proposals increases, as the engagement from the community accelerates, we're going to have more and more potentially disparate or contentious or not complementary proposals getting bundled up into single executives. And we really need to, at some point, we really need to address this issue head on. How do we handle a significant number of decisions on a weekly basis without turning this into an all or nothing type operation? All right, but let's leave it there because I'm unwilling to present strong opinions and or answers. So let's leave it to the community.
I'll do it.
All right, yeah, LongForWisdom. Why don't you do it? What do we do?
We need to upgrade the chief.
All right, done. Now, so yeah, so you know what? Okay, let's do that though. Do you have strong opinions? Do you have lots of thoughts? Do you have ideas? I'm not asking for them now. That's kind of a yes or no question. If you do.
Yeah.
It seems like a more realistic goal is to try and have the migration contract emptied by like the 24th, and then have that be our kind of goal is, okay, then we're ready to shut down SCD.
So yeah, that feels like a bit of a non sequitur, but yeah, I think that's generally the idea. But one of the things that I'm gonna put the spotlight on Mariano again next week because or Derek, I'm gonna push somebody under the bus here, but there's a significant number of things that need to happen in a specific order for a shutdown to happen. There's no big red button that we break the glass and then that's the end of SCD. Like, well, maybe there is, but that might be disastrous. So there's risk that needs to be involved with some decisions, or like at least modeling up some options here. Smart contracts teams need to have things in place. Potentially ecosystem actors need to be on board, so the integrations teams need to be able to reach out to people. There's stakeholders in the community, like there's large CDP owners that potentially should be involved with this process too. There's communication aspects. This needs to be broadly, it needs to be broadcast to the crypto DeFi ecosystem that this thing is going away. So be prepared. So there's all kinds of things that need to happen. So we picked a date. That was the easiest part. Now we need to figure out how and who and when. And well, we already got the when, obviously. But anyways, it's not as simple. So we need to start thinking about this, identifying stakeholders and figuring out what feasibility looks like for this kind of stuff. Hopefully we can dig into it again in depth next week as the date is getting dangerously close. All right, thank you, Mariano. MakerMan, you have some projects, I have app project on the go. Well, you have two, but let's talk about one of them. Can you give us a brief overview of what's going on with the zero bid modeling that you have on the go?
Sure. Hopefully this stays together and not too much happens in my background. So simple upshot, we know we had the zero bid auctions. And one of the things in my head was for scenario analysis and risk analysis to use actual liquidation data against these scenarios. And it begged another question. Once you have the liquidation data, you can look at it and determine operational characteristics, not just in the liquidations, but across what it's doing financially to the whole system, everybody. And so now we finally have that data. It's like, I'm not going to make this a long story about how we have it, but we have Bob Face put up a Maker Auctions IO site, and he did work that started it, and then I asked him for a CSV, and he promptly provided it. So I kind of have a whole set of the auctions. So I can run this, look at these scenarios, like what happened. And so I can use that data also to deal with figuring out if we decide to compensate people, what that looks like. And the data itself is very interesting. I just got my hands on it. It will take a little time, but my hope is to provide kind of a liquidation report. We should think about a liquidation dashboard. You know, we kind of have stuff like this, but conceptually, how do you model this? What data do you need? And kind of, I'm going after that right now. And I finally have two different sets of data, and I have White Rabbit's data, which is a subset within it. And so I should be able to just run and match all this stuff up. And if I'm lucky with all the data I have a vault number. I can look at what happened to them, so I can do this by vaults, but it's going to take some time, and I'm doing lots of other things too. So there's stuff I might want, like I'm really looking for minutely data on the ETHUSD. I think I have an OSM handle, like I would just want a number of the OSMs that go with that CSV, but we'll see if Bob Face can provide it. My hope is that I'll have a report certainly for the zero bid auctions pretty soon, but kind of a general liquidation report. I don't have it yet. I have data. So that's the upshot on that.
All right, thanks for that recap. Yet another example of community members stepping up and doing a huge lift, which is very inspiring. If you think you can help MakerMan, or you have access to that data, or you do have ticks of OSM prices, minutes, a minute or hour, regardless, reach out to MakerMan and see if there's something you can do to help, particularly if you're a stakeholder or deeply engaged with the question of zero bid auction compensation. There's also, once again, hit the forums, because there's long discussions there from all angles, from the governance perspective, from the vault holders perspectives, from the ecosystem's perspective. It's worth reviewing. So we can continue momentum on this issue. All right, who do we have next? Cyrus rushed the show at the beginning, so that's taken care of. So Vishesh, do you want to talk about state of the phase?
Sure. Okay. So just to touch on total DAI supplies at 80 million. Interesting things to note. 75 million of that is from ETH. They're down to 380K-ish from BAT, and about 800,000 from USDC, which is down a bit from its all-time high, and about 3.5 million for the migration contract, which is a large chunk. So in terms of what the collateral portfolio has been doing, so ETH price is up a bit compared to sort of where it was a few weeks ago. And what's interesting to note is throughout this whole time frame, the DAI price has kind of kept steady, 1 to 2 cents above $1. As that ETH price started to run up a bit more in the last 2 to 3 days, that DAI price bowed slightly. So this is just keeping its sort of long term stays pretty stable, but in short term fluctuates kind of inversely with what ETH is doing. But I think the big thing that everyone's kind of been talking about with this is just that it's consistently, the DAI peg is consistently maintaining, this is like 2 cent buffer to the peg. Though comparatively, like these trading volumes are pretty low. So what's persisting here is that not that many people have been trading their DAI. So though that DAI supply had come up, from the 60s to about 75 the amount of that that's been traded is comparatively low. And so if we look at, like, in the last 30 days or so, you had 380 million DAI being traded. But, you know, and again, that average price has come down to about $1.03 for the last month or so. That's just kind of naturally because there was more and more trades happening at like $1.01 and $1.02. But what was interesting to note is that 30-day volume had just significantly outpaced what we've seen in the last like 7 to 14 days, which has just been much lower. Also, it's kind of resumed a chunk for DYDX. So what we saw was during the crazy time frame, Oasis had picked up a bit more of its older sort of share of the DAI trading, but you know, recently this is kind of pretty even between DYDX and Oasis, and then a little bit more on Coinbase, a little bit less, I would say, on Uniswap, and a little bit more on Kyber than kind of the longer run averages. But yeah, I mean, I think the question that's on a lot of people's minds is sort of, is the DAI price going up? Is it going down? Is it staying steady? I think by and large, it's been staying steady with, you know, short timescale fluctuations, obviously naturally with what ETH price does. So what's interesting is, and I actually haven't shown this here, but it is interesting to note when the correlations between ETH and DAI flip. So like I said, when ETH is crashing, DAI is very well negatively correlated to ETH. When ETH is rising, you actually tend to, like when it's rising in a longer time scale and confidence sort of returns, you see that correlation actually resume like more of a positive trend. So in the short term, if ETH is going down, but in the long term, people think it is going up, you will see DAI price actually go down. If in the long run, people are uncertain about ETH, and in the short run, the ETH price goes down, what we see is, you know, that DAI price going up. And this kind of makes sense in terms of it's all about leverage. So what's really interesting to note is there's a fundamental shift, which was this kind of increased confidence, but also increased perceived value on holding DAI, which has led to this kind of consistent 1 to 2 cent buffer on the DAI price. And that's something that, you know, as I said, you know, last week and the week before, that I think is kind of persisting. And we can talk about the reasons for it persisting. But what is interesting to note is slight uptick in activity in the last 2 to 3 days makes sense with ETH price starting to go up if you assume that people are a bit more confident and bullish on ETH now. So that may start to be what we're seeing. But the interesting thing to note is as that price has continued to come up, the DAI price, if it goes up as well, that would actually indicate like a lack of confidence potentially in this being a persistent trend, and people either sourcing DAI to use it to pay back loans or to get ready to participate in liquidations or things like that, because there's not sort of this strong yield case for holding DAI right now. It's much lower than what it has been in the past. So if people are sourcing DAI, it's not because they're necessarily minting a bunch of new debt. That amount has been comparatively smaller. It's primarily likely due to market making and desire to participate in liquidations and things like that if they do happen. So it appears that the sentiment on the whole DAI situation right now is kind of a wait and see and maybe a little bit of like hedging behavior. So what we sort of saw with the vault positions was coming out of the March 12th like crash situation. This wall and the smaller one are two things to watch in terms of collateral risk. But essentially, these walls were at much lower prices at the time. So it makes sense that these tend to be relative to what the current ETH price is. So if ETH price goes up, it makes sense that your risk barriers move up as well. And that is kind of a trend that we've seen historically over time with CDPs and vaults, is that there's like this rebalancing behavior where when ETH price goes up, commensurately the collateralizations move, or rather the collateralizations sort of stay pretty steady, and the liquidation prices move. So what's interesting is this is the risk portfolio. As the ETH price has come up recently, we saw an uptick in this 200 to 250 category. Coming out of the whole crash situation, there was a huge block of the debt centered around 300 to 350% collateralization. And it's sort of, it was bimodal as of like last week, where you had sort of a skew and a peak leading up to the 350 bucket, and then another one at 500 plus. And then basically now it's sort of got this W shape, in the sense that this 200 to 250 category is what's come up since then. So a bit more debt at a bit riskier categories, despite the ETH price coming up pretty significantly. So that's just indicating some rebalancing. Again, people kind of taking risks, or rather internalizing changing external variables, and kind of maintaining their risks. Okay, yeah, I'll kind of leave it at that and double click on things if there's specific questions.
I'm not seeing anything in the sidebar. Did anybody in the call want to jump on the mic and ask a question? Possibly not. Somebody thinking of that? Will, is that you?
Yeah. I was thinking about that that unusual, relatively unusual behavior of the peg with ETH, the ETH going up, and actually the DAI price, like weighted average, actually not coming down. Other than liquidity and the use for the liquidations, or the use of DAI for trading elsewhere. Have you got any thoughts on why we may actually start to see that kind of new kind of trend, Ishash?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say anything here is like a new trend, but if you reason about it, like, why does DAI tend to think about it, why does DAI tend to go up if ETH is going down? Well, people sourcing DAI to repay debt, liquidations, etc. That makes sense. Why would DAI go down if ETH price is going up? Well, people getting more bullish, leveraging their positions and selling DAI in the process. So what's interesting here is, though ETH is going up, I wouldn't index too much on DAI going up. What I would index more on is DAI not going down. And I think that is just because there is still somewhat of a hesitancy potentially on leverage. And even though ETH price is going up, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are more bullish on ETH and willing to lever up further.
Yeah, it would make sense, but in itself, I think that's kind of like an interesting point, data point that potentially we didn't have that a lot before. in the previous cycles of leveraging and deleveraging. In this cycle, there is kind of like an expectancy, which I think may also have a flow-on effect on that distribution graph of the collateral ratio. The reason why you're seeing more of that collateralization going up is not necessarily because of people actually taking a less risk appetite, but just kind of like leaving the price of ETH going up and not actually kind of, I think those two are kind of very related in my view. The collateralization market's actually moving to the right, and the fact that the price of DAI is not coming down because of it, the leveraging. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. Here's the longer run average graph. So this is the 30-day graph. So what you see here is pretty damn well tracking between DAI and ETH. Now, what's interesting is essentially the flipping point, or the reversal here, is because the ETH price. So we saw, like, for example, ETH price dip slightly on April 1st and then start increasing April 2nd, April 3rd. So on April 1st, there was a little bit of a jump in the DAI peg, and then it slowly started to deflate a little. Now here, there's been no, like, in the last 2-3 days, it's just been a consistent kind of climb in ETH. There's been no real dip in the ETH price. And then this DAI price basically starting to increase smack dab as soon as the ETH price started to increase. And a lot of this trading recently that's happening at the higher values is on Oasis. And then we see sort of Kyber and DYDX having a lot more of the trades kind of either really high or really low compared to the average. And so what's happening is there's potentially kind of this inflationary effect from people kind of market making potentially on DAI. And that would be a reasonable explanation, is people accumulating DAI in anticipation of what other users might do is a potential explanation for the increase. As far as an explanation for not having a decrease, that is kind of what we talked about before in terms of sentiment may not have shifted on using Maker for leverage at this particular moment, despite ETH price going up.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, or kind of like also like the graph there on the ETH price, you see that there's also an uptick in the velocity of that uptick, which also might explain why there might be a lag in between them. Whereas actually the other ones, when you go back to that graph, you can see like around the second, third of April, it's kind of like it's coming up, but it's coming up at a velocity that is like is lower. Whereas actually in the last couple of days, that actually velocity actually kind of like uptick is really high, and therefore there could actually be a lag as well in the leveraging and the positioning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and that lag would be very reasonably explained in the sense that people may not trust a sudden increase, whereas longer run increases may have more of an impact on sentiment, right? If ETH is bullish over time, if ETH is rising over time, people may be more bullish on taking leverage. But if ETH suddenly increases, there are a lot of reasons why that wouldn't necessarily be wouldn't necessarily cause a bunch of people to take out leverage, in the sense that, one, if it's a sudden jump, A, they may not trust that it's going to continue to increase, and B, they may have sort of this mentality of, oh, I've missed the boat on this jump, and so it doesn't make sense to take out a bunch of leverage right now. So there's a lot of reasons why you can, like, think about why people would do these kinds of things.
Yeah. Sounds good. It was just an observation on a graph, but it's all good. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Well, Simone, you had an interesting question, though. Do you want to ask that, or do you want me to read that out?
Oh.
Yeah, I can ask that. Do we have any data on other platforms as to whether or not other platforms that provide leverage to lever up on ETH as it's rising are enjoying, I don't know, let's say growth or, you know, more leverage? I guess I'm trying to drill in on whether or not we think this is a market-wide trend or whether or not there is a loss of confidence in the Maker protocol.
Yeah, so I mean, what we did see was, you know, in the last 24 hours or so, like a 2%-ish increase in the amount of borrow on compound. That's, I don't know that that's like a large enough margin to be making conclusions per se, but yeah, I mean, there have been you know, more loans taken out as well on compound. I don't think those are necessarily outpacing, like there was a slight increase in the amount of DAI minted overall as well. So I don't know that those increases are necessarily like out of frame with what's been happening on Maker. So I don't think there's a strong case yet for like Maker losing market share to other platforms or something, but that will definitely be something to continue to watch as there's more activity globally. But at least in terms of DAI borrowing and at least in terms of other secondary lending platforms, I don't think we're yet at a place of concluding that like they're seeing a huge uptick in activity and Maker is not.
Actually, I don't want to belabor this because the call's already kind of long. If you can, while I'm talking, Vishesh, bring up that long-term chart again, because I don't hear you talking about it. But somebody closed out 6 million vault. I think it's a vault. It wasn't a CDP, and that's what drove the price to the peg to like 104. I didn't even see it on the chart. The 104 prints on Coinbase. It went to 104.5. While this guy was just hammering on the DAI USDC to get his liquidity. And then that spread out, like everybody was trying to source liquidity. Like we were talking about it in chat. Like somebody posted the CDP that actually closed out. It was a big number. And he did it for about 2 hours, just hammered on the asks, and then put up a 104 bid and just took everything that he could get. Anyway, so if you had that chart, what I was going to say is if you look at it carefully, you see these sharp little dips and doodles, and around those you see a lot of the liquidity spikes, right? You see all the printed trades. And it's kind of hard to make out the detail of those printed trades. You just see the bloody spread on them, right? And so we can go back to the first big, I mean, there was a big dip. That was our big event. But if you go to that, just do the 60, go back further. Let's see it all. Like I want to see like 90 days. Ideally, but that 330 spike, we drop down and you just see, you know, if you watch this on the markets, typically we see DAI sourcing being driven up when ETH price goes down. Absolutely right on that. The mystery here is we've been having ETH price rising, and it's like, why is the peg still high? There was a last bump that I don't even see on here that hit 104 on Coinbase. I mean, he literally had a bid in there. We saw it for a while. And I don't even see it on this chart. The Coinbase 104s that happened, I see the 103s, I see all the activity. I just don't see that 104 was actually hit. And I know I saw it because I traded this. I traded it on DYDX in the 103 range up to 103.5, 103.79, I think was my highest print of a trade, something like that. And so I'm not seeing some of the data, I guess is what I'm saying. But generally, it's like there isn't a lot of mystery here, but what you see is a lot of activity. Like when we did the first rise from like 135 to like 142, a lot of activity. That didn't really, it moved the peg around a lot and it started it to downtrend, right? We see the right trends, I guess is what I'm saying. Generally, I noticed as this thing was going up fast, it's like you don't see it in this mash of data. It's like overall, the peg was trending down, but then all of a sudden, you don't see the dips in the price. There was a lot of price volatility here. in ETH, even though it was generally going up. We went up to like 175 and then crashed to like 160 and then bounced back up again while this guy was doing a 6 million liquidity find. And so there was a lot of real trading action here. I mean, literally 6 million out of 80 million outstanding is 10% of available supply. And when you start crunching numbers on that, these kind of moves are being driven by just a general lack of liquidity. That basically we lost a lot of liquidity in this event, and a lot of people were hurt. So I don't think the understanding here is that the normal activity is happening, but there's an underlying driver for liquidity, which brings me to the other point, the Psi SCD closure. CDP 3088 has been active recently. If people don't know this, they woke up and they bought some Maker, but they haven't moved on their SCD closure, and I don't know whether they showed up in chat and was saying, I have a really big loan, I'm looking for Psi liquidity, where do I find it? And then they went away. Maker Boom, if you're out there, come back, please. Or whoever has the CDP, please wake up and talk to the community. But I'm just saying, generally, I think there's a lot of liquidity trying to be sourced in these markets for various reasons. Whether they're short, whatever, don't know. But they're trying to close out stuff and get access to their ETH, particularly in this price rise. And so I think it's the reason why this peg is really staying up. And then you heap on people who are going DAI short already at 103 and still haven't maybe closed. I don't know if you didn't do that DAI at trades. I don't feel for you too much. I've been out of that trade for a while. But just generally, I think that's going on here, and this is what we're seeing. Because you would expect it during this huge rise at the peg to go down. It's like, I'm in a DAI in there. I sold it. Who's buying it and closing it out? And then we had, long ago, Maker going on the market and buying DAI effectively to burn it, to cover what we lost. And so I see that as an effective burn. So I think this whole market is just kind of like DAI supply hurting to some extent, and it just can't find it because we have to have collateral to have it. And so that's my uptake on all of this, is that while it looks weird and we might not understand it, I think we kind of do. We just don't know what to do about it. So I'm done with this. Thank you, everybody, for putting up with it.
No, thanks to you, Makerman. It was good insight. So I think that there was a question in there at the beginning, and I think it was, why doesn't that graph reflect the unusual DAI activity? It looks like in the sidebar, LongForWisdom might have pointed out that DAI USDC doesn't show up in those graphs. Is that true, Vishesh?
Sorry, say that again?
DAI USDC isn't covered in those graphs?
No, it's not. Yeah.
Is that an oversight on your part, Vishesh? Or is that excluded for a reason?
I mean, that's just not in the data set yet.
Yeah. All right, cool. So we are at an hour and a half almost perfectly. So I think that maybe we can put a fork in it there, unless there's any last minute burning questions. I'll give people an opportunity to type them while I do the post ambles. Governance happens in the forums, lots and lots of activity, important things are happening, big decisions are getting made in real time. So please don't sleep on the fact that things are going on and that your input is required. So please join us in the forums and be heard. All right, thanks everybody. Look for a lightly edited version of this call in YouTube very soon. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Rich.